you so much for everyone for joining us. A few things, we're going to be discussing Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. Just a few things before we start. If you can make sure that you are muted throughout the session, and at the end of the session, we will have a Q&A. So if you have any questions that come up, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll address them at the end. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce David Patterson. He holds the Halil A. Feinberg Distinguished Chair in Holocaust Studies at the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at the University of Texas at Dallas, and is a senior research fellow for the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism Policy. He's a member of the executive board of the annual Scholars Conference on the Holocaust in Churches. He has lectured at universities on 6 continents and throughout the United States. He's also a winner of the National Jewish Book Award, the Court Jewish Book Award, and the Holocaust Scholars Conference Eternal Flame Award. He's published 40 books and more than 240 articles, essays, and book chapters on anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and Jewish studies. His most recent books are Judaism, Anti-Semitism, Holocaust, Making the Connections, Shoah and Torah, Portraits, Elie Wiesel's Hasidic Legacy, The Holocaust and Non-Representable, and Anti-Semitism and its Metaphysical Origins. So thank you so much for joining us. And Dr. Patterson, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have an outline and notes that I think might be useful because I'm going to mention lots of names and such. So if you're recording and people want to go back over the names at some point, that will be an option. So let me just start by guiding us through this outline. I'm going to talk about Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. What does one have to do with the other? And I want to begin with this quote from Elie Wiesel, who says that the enemy killed the Jews and he made them disappear in smoke and ashes. So every Jew was killed twice. And now he, the denier, would kill them for a third time by depriving them of their past. Nothing could be as ugly, as inhuman as the wish to deprive the dead victims of their death. And indeed, one of the aims of the Nazis was not only to murder the Jews, but to deprive them of their death and take all memory of the Jews away from them. Now, how do we approach Holocaust denial? And many of the approaches want to categorize it and put it into the category of bigotry in general or perversion of reason. The deniers are irrational. Reason guides our academic intellectual inquiry. And so this just falls outside of that. But it seems to me it runs much deeper. Holocaust denial is about a certain what I call anti-historical anti-Semitism. It's an expulsion of Jews from history. The Jews of Europe and the Middle East have a history of expulsion from space. And every country in Europe at one time or another expelled its Jews from their space. And Holocaust denial is about expelling Jews from time. So the anti-Semitism seems to me, it's not a subset of human hatred in general, it's the ground of human hatred. Why? Because in order to hate the other human being, which is what anti-Semitism is, it's not just a hatred of the Jew, it's a hatred of the other human being. You have to establish a premise that opposes the basic Jewish premise, namely that all human beings are connected through Adam and connected through God. Each of us is a child of Adam and a child of God. Therefore, there is no race. There is no racism. Anti-Semitism is not a form of racism but rather racism is a form of anti-Semitism. So, and I think this is what is driving Holocaust denial. So it's not about evidence. When I discuss this with my students and colleagues, how can anyone refute the evidence of of history? Short answer is it's not about evidence. I mean, other horrors in history have been ignored, but they have not been explicitly and systematically denied on a worldwide scale. And Holocaust denial is worldwide, and it's one of the singular features of the Holocaust itself, worldwide. So I have a brief history of denial in the West. This goes back to as early as 1943 with Alexander Ratcliffe, the head of the British Protestant League, a British fascist organization, certainly anti-Semitic. He published a pamphlet called The Truth About the Jews, which argued that by 1943, the reports of the extermination were coming in. Indeed, on August 24th, 1941, just weeks after the Einsatzgruppen and the killing units went into action, Winston Churchill in a radio broadcast declared, "We are in the presence of a crime without a name." So already, in August 1941, we're getting the reports of mass murder. 1943, Ratcliffe publishes his pamphlet. Of course, we would expect the perpetrators. Never happened, never happened, never happened. Indeed, we have many examples of survivors reporting that when they were in the camp, Nazis would say to them, "Even if you survive, no one will believe it. Go ahead. Even if you get out of here, go ahead, tell them what happened. No one will believe it. No one will believe it." And these are just a few of the Nazi leaders: Ernst Rommel, Dr. Heinrich Maltz, served under Ernst Kaltenbrunner, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, Wilfried von Oven, Wehrmacht officer. And these are others on record denying that anything ever happened. And of course, this, in the aftermath, you have a lineup of individuals who would pass themselves off as authors, scholars, researchers. And you'll notice, as you go through this lineup, the Holocaust deniers do not belong to one political party or another. They're not uneducated. It's not a matter of education or political affiliation. Anti-Semitism is not the monopoly of anyone as far as their training, their learning, or their political inclinations here. So you have, early on, I have a list of famous deniers or infamous deniers from after the Shoah, after the Holocaust. Is the fascist Maurice Bardèche. He's the author of a book called Nuremberg, or the Promised Land, in which he argues, and this is an early argument and form of Holocaust denial, that the Jews were the perpetrators. The world Jewish conspiracy controlled the Nazi government. Why? Because, as Paul Rossignier, another denier, says, the Zionist establishment invented this lie. Why? Because the Zionists have an interest in driving the Jews out of Europe and establishing Europe as a place hostile to Jews. So either the Jews did it or the Zionists made it up to drive the Jews into then Palestine and what is now Israel. Okay. Then we have the apologists for Hitler, Francis Yockey, in his book dedicated to Hitler, and David Hogan, a graduate of Harvard University, The Myth of the 6 Million, Austin App. This is an important figure, professor, and among the members of the Nazi Party, the professors represented a very high percentage. The highest percentage of the intelligentsia who were members of the party were doctors, followed closely by professors and then by attorneys. So again, this is not a question of intellect or education. Austin App, in his book, The 6 Million Swindle, as we'll see shortly, outlines principles that guide other Holocaust deniers. Richard Farrell, Arthur Butts, he's quite famous in the United States, engineering professor at Northwestern University. His book, The Hoax of the 20th Century, published in 1926, gained a lot of currency because it had all the footnotes, it had hundreds of footnotes. So it's well researched, and the research shores up the lie, of course. Willis Carto, founder of the Institute for Historical Review, which is its name, Institute for Historical Review. They have a journal. I've had students who do research on the Holocaust. They'll go to the Journal of Historical Review. Sounds legit, right? And my student, they can't tell one from the other. This is the guy, if you know who Mel Mermelstein was, some of you may remember his lawsuit against the Institute for Historical Review. They put up a prize of $25,000, I think it was, for anyone who could prove the Holocaust happened. Mel Mermelstein, famous survivor, sued them, won his case in California. This goes back, 30 years. Here's one. This is interesting. Robert Foisson, a French professor, wrote a book, published a book in 1980 called The Problem of the Gas Chambers, with an introduction written by Harvard University linguistics professor and expert Noam Chomsky. Okay, so here we have a Jewish Harvard professor endorsing this work of Holocaust denial. You may remember David Irving, the British historian who filed suit against Deborah Lipstadt in the movie Denial. There was a movie made about it 3-4 years ago. In her book on Holocaust denial, Deborah Lipstadt accused him of being a denier. He sued her and he lost his case. We saw the fascist Bardesh. Now we have the Marxist Roger Garaudy, the author of The Founding Myths of Israel. Part of Holocaust denial, a huge part, defining part of it, goes to delegitimizing the Jewish state, which was established as a haven for the Jewish people, who, as Theodore Herzl said, would never be safe as long as they were guests in somebody else's house. So they need not just a homeland, but a haven. And this work, The Founding Myths of Modern Israel, tries to debunk the need for a homeland. I mentioned here Ernst Nolte, a very prominent German philosopher, historian, major intellectual in Germany, argues that the killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, were justified because the Jews in the East posed an existential threat to the Reich, to Germany. Bradley Smith, another notorious one. He's the founder of the Committee on Open Debate on the Holocaust. This is a strategy used by deniers. Let's have an open debate, as if there were anything to debate, right? So he would publish full-page ads in campus newspaper targeting college students, saying, hey, we're here to investigate the truth. Let's look at the facts, let's have a debate, and so on. This would be like debating whether or not George Washington was the first president of the United States. Let's have a debate. This is not about debating facts. And then there are others around the world. I'm going to move along in the interest of time a little bit, but in Italy, Carlo Mantonio, Gerhard Hosek in Austria, Masami Uno in Japan, Siegfried Ellwanger in Brazil. And this is Holocaust denial is a worldwide phenomenon. It's worldwide, okay? And it's part of the singularity of the Holocaust itself. I mentioned Austin App earlier, his 8 principles of Holocaust deniers that, the Reich wanted to solve the Germany's Jewish problem by immigration. The gas chambers never existed. Most Jews who disappeared into the Soviet territories. Jews who died were subversive, spies, saboteurs. In other words, they deserved to die. If 6 million were actually murdered, Israel would open up its archive. Israel's opened up its archives, so this is a non-issue. There's no evidence to support the claims of Holocaust, patently absurd, right? The accusers and not the accused must bear the burden of proof. Again, this is related to the previous point. And it's discrepancy in numbers. I mean, one of the tactics of the deniers is to go to this source, that source, the other source. And we were talking about numbers in the millions, whether you're off by 10, 20, even 100,000 here, 100,000 there, it's no evidence that it didn't happen, of course. It's not a matter of evidence, as I said. Maurice Bardesh, whom I mentioned before, that argued that the Jews were behind it anyway. Eyewitnesses are unreliable. The horrors of Stalin shouldn't be forgotten. And this is a common deflection. Hitler, forget about Hitler, look at Stalin. Okay, this in the bloodlands. It wasn't just the Nazis, it's also the Soviets. Whatever atrocities were committed in the camps were perpetrated by Jews. The Nazis didn't want to exterminate the Jews. And the use of gas was to prevent disease. In other words, underlying these Holocaust denial premises is that, like Satan, world Jewry is ubiquitous, invisible, and behind every evil, including they're behind the Holocaust. Okay. All Jews who were murdered deserved it because the Jews embody the essence of evil. The anti-Semitic premise is not that all Jews are evil, but all evil is Jewish. So you have to eradicate, exterminate the Jews to purge the world, purify the world of evil. The Jews control all the media, all the information sources, and so they, of course, control everything anyone knows about what happened. And again, the Jews are evil by definition. Therefore, the Nazis, by definition, are innocent. Okay, that's what's underlining this phenomenon of Holocaust denial, certainly in the West. But what about I think there's a a separate phenomenon of denial worthy of examination in the Muslim world. In the West, denial is relatively marginal. You can study the Holocaust in numerous universities, including the one where we are now. There are no universities in the Muslim world that offer courses on the Holocaust, or degrees in the Holocaust, or certificates in the Holocaust. Okay. I'm speaking of the institutions and not of individuals. Okay. Individuals, yes. Institutions, no. And you do have examples of what I call the anti-historical anti-Semitism, namely a view of the Jews that would remove Jews from history, from sacred history, from the stage of history. For example, the Quran argues that Abraham was not a Jew, that the Jews falsified scripture and the account of in the Hebrew Bible of sacred history. So this appropriation of the sacred word is central to an appropriation of sacred history. And indeed, there are countries, I mean, people in the upper echelons of government in countries such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, not to mention Iran, who deny the Holocaust. There have been conferences in Beirut, Amman, Tehran, as you see these days, 2001, 2006, conferences whose theme was the Holocaust didn't happen. It's the invention of the Zionists. Now, when Hitler passed away, his last words in his political will, which he wrote hours before he committed suicide, was to urge the world to carry on with what he called a merciless resistance to the universal poisoner of all peoples, international Jewry. And Holocaust denial is part of this struggle against international Jewry. And when we see it in many quarters around the world, but we see it most systematically, pervasively, in its most deadly forms in Islamic jihadism, in the formation of jihadist states, in the formation of jihadist armies, ISIS, in the formation of governments whose official policy entail the obliteration of the Jews. The Hezbollah leader, Hezbollah, as you may know, founded, its foundations are in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah is an offshoot of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Hassan Nasrallah is a notorious Holocaust denier. With Hezbollah, he accuses the Jews of exploiting the Holocaust to promote the Zionist agenda. The Muslim Brotherhood has a similar position. The Muslim Brotherhood is the origin of most of the jihadist movements in the world, not all, but most. The Brotherhood was founded in 1928. I have a whole separate lecture about the Brotherhood. Islamic Republic of Iran traces its origin to the Brotherhood, and Hamas, that everyone here I'm sure has heard of, identifies itself as a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas maintains that the Jews lie about the Holocaust. If it happened, they did it. If Hitler did it, he was the instrument of Allah, because the Jews are evil incarnate. So, I mean, you have this shifting of the claims, namely that, it never happened. If it did happen, the Jews did it. And if the Jews, and if Hitler killed the Jews, it's because it was the will of Allah. The thinking is all over the chart here. Article 20, of the Hamas charter equates the Jews with Nazis. And this is itself a form of Holocaust denial. The comparison, the equation, not comparison, equation of Jews with Nazis. Gaza is the Warsaw Ghetto, and this total turnaround. Yeah, I have Mahmoud Abbas. He's my next point. My wife is handing me cues, as you can see in my outline here. My next player here is Mahmoud Abbas. Who's Mahmoud Abbas? Mahmoud Abbas, with Yasser Arafat, founded Fatah in 1959, and Mahmoud Abbas is still with us, unlike Yasser Arafat. Mahmoud Abbas wrote a doctoral dissertation in Moscow, Dr. Mahmoud Abbas, titled The Other Side, in which Abbas, the moderate, right, argues that the Jews, the other side, the Jews were actually the ones behind the Holocaust in order, again, to drive the Jews of Europe into then Palestine. So denial, Holocaust denial is often part of anti-Zionism. So why? Because anti-Zionism Zionism arose with the realization that the Jews are not safe in other lands, in foreign lands, that the Jews need a haven where they can go. I remember seeing an interview with a French Jew. There's a French aliyah recent years who went to Israel. He was interviewed. Why did you come to Israel? Isn't it kind of dangerous here? He said, yes, but here, when you call the police, they come. In France, they don't. So it's a haven. If the Holocaust didn't happen, then the Jews don't need a haven. So the anti-Zionists oppose not the existence, oppose the existence and not the policies. The opposition is not to the policies, but to the presence of the Jewish state. Why? Because the Jewish state is unnecessary. The Jews are perfectly safe elsewhere. And let me spend, before I'm done, a few minutes talking about more subtle manifestations of Holocaust denial. And this is in some ways the most insidious because it's the most acceptable and fashionable and seemingly innocuous. And we see this in like a psychological denial. I'm sure those of you who have taken courses on the Holocaust, I am sure, have had friends who say, why are you taking a course on the Holocaust? It's so depressing. Why would you want to, traumatize yourself with that? And it is traumatizing. It is depressing. But you don't have to be a Nazi or a jihadist to be tempted to flee from this trauma. And it's a trauma that has to do with ethical implications. There's no studying the Holocaust innocently. I can study the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. I can study even, Spanish Inquisition. I can study the history of America and the settling of the Pilgrims innocently, right? There's no studying the Holocaust innocently because it's about fundamentally what is a human being, what is the value of the human being, and what is my responsibility to and for the other human being. I think this is why we want to turn away from it. In my own experience, I've been the first one to teach a course on the Holocaust at 2 other universities. And when I was at those universities and we would have a faculty meeting, I'd say, what are you going to teach? What are you going to teach? Well, I'm going to do a class on the Holocaust. And I'd had a colleague ask me, are you going to teach a course on the Holocaust again? Can't we get over it? Everyone's sick of it. It happened so long ago. Nobody asks, you're going to teach a course on the Civil War again? Can't we get over it? It happened so long ago. But the Holocaust presses this button. I've had two historians, so-called Holocaust historians, say to me, when we engage the Holocaust, we can't use the word evil, which I use, because of the religious baggage. Okay, the religious baggage is ethical baggage. There's this phenomenon, in my view, of turning away from the ethical implication, which is a form, in my view, of Holocaust denial. I was once at a scholars conference on the Holocaust with a survivor, close friend of mine, a woman whom I knew as a scholar of Russian literature. We went to a plenary session, panel of scholars, right? They're holding forth on Holocaust this, Holocaust that. They're very intellectual. And we walked out. She looked at me with this forlorn face. And she said, I know now what the scholars want us, the survivors, to do. They want us to die. Because they don't want to look in our eyes. They don't want to confront the question of human sanctity and human responsibility that devolves upon them. So she opened my eyes to a phenomenon that I call Holocaust studies without the Holocaust. It relativizes the Holocaust. It trivializes the Holocaust in ways that Alvin Rosenfeld points out in his book called The End of the Holocaust. And he writes the following, as you can see, as the mass murder of millions of innocent people is trivialized and vulgarized, and I would add relativized, a catastrophic history bloody to its core is lightened of its historical burden. A less taxing version of a tragic history begins to emerge, still full of suffering, to be sure, but a suffering relieved of its weightiest moral and intellectual demands, which are precisely its Jewish demands. To de-Judaize the Holocaust, which is a widespread phenomenon, is to drain the Holocaust of its ethical demand, in my view. So as the Jew vanishes into general explanations, the Jew vanishes into various agendas, race, class, gender studies, post-colonial cultural studies, victim studies in general. So we narrate the Jew out of the picture. And this is tied to a view of history. This is related to what I call anti-historical anti-Semitism, removing the Jew from history. How? By reducing history to narrative. There is no history, there's only narrative. And if it's only narrative, then we don't have to confront the questions that come to us through the Jewish people. Namely, the first question put to the first human, where are you? We don't want to look into the faces of the slaughtered Jews because they ask us, where are you? They pose this question to us from above, from a sky transformed into a cemetery. They ask us, where's your brother? What have you done? And it seems to me that anti-Semitism, and in the form of Holocaust denial and other forms, every form, is an assault on the one who poses this question. We hide from the question, as Adam hid from the question, by burying the Jews in the category of victim in general. In doing so, we play into the hands of Holocaust denier by rendering the study of the Holocaust Judenrein. We de-Judaize the Holocaust. So instead of speaking of Jews and Judaism, we speak of coping and drama, dialogue, healing, representation. Remember, all of these, everything except the singular assault on the teaching and the tradition of Judaism, which As Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi ideologue, said, Judaism is the poison. Judaism is what we have to purge. The Nazis themselves took this position, and we often play into those hands. So from a Jewish perspective, history, what is the history? History is, from a Jewish perspective, is the history of the presence of God in the realm of space. It's the history of a human engagement with God. It's a human engagement with memory and the commandment prohibiting murder. That's what must be remembered. So we have from Elie Wiesel, Molevi, both of them independently describe the Holocaust as a war against memory. Holocaust denial is part of the war against memory. A memory of what? Not just what happened, but why it matters. Memory of the war against, again, this fundamental prohibition against murder, which is tied to the war against God. And of course, memory is about the future. Holocaust denial denies the Jews not only of their past, but of their future, of Jewish children. And indeed, Jewish children were the first targets of the Holocaust. More than 90% of the Jewish children of Europe were murdered in the Holocaust. They were the first targets. And indeed, the biblical word for history, toldot, has the same root as the word for child. Murdering history is about murdering children. Murdering children is about murdering the future. The future is a dimension of meaning. Meaning lies in what we have yet to attain. Meaning lies in an afterward. And one of the singularities of the Holocaust, I would say, and my student, Sarah Snyder, knows that speaking of afterward becomes problematic. And this afterward is what the Holocaust deniers would deny. So let me close. The deniers, as I've suggested, would silence the question that comes both from within and from beyond the Jewish people by turning them over to the silence of the grave. But the question is, the original questions: where are you? Where's your brother? What have you done? And it's not even the silence of the grave. It's not even a silence. It's a complete obliteration of memory and all predicates. The Nazis didn't want the Jews to be alive or dead. They didn't want the Jews to be anything. They wanted to erase all of the predicates. And so the Holocaust deniers are literally grave robbers. They rob the Jews of their graves. They take the graves, they relegate the graves to oblivion. The Jews were never there. Mount Sinai was never there. Prohibition was against murder was never there. God of Abraham was never there. And therefore, we are free to murder the Jews. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So if anyone has questions, please put them in chat. I've already got a few, but if you have any questions, you can either send them directly to me or just in the chat. Dr. Patterson, so thank you so much. I have a lot of great questions. So the first one I want to ask is if we've seen an increase in Holocaust denial or I suppose Holocaust revisionism in recent times.
Yes, but yes, short answer, yes. We've seen an increase in Holocaust denial. And the two forms that it takes predominantly are, first of all, that in the increase in anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is not only the most widespread and most fashionable form of anti-Semitism, but it has become a morally required form of anti-Semitism. And by anti-Zionism, I mean those who are opposed, again, to the presence of the Jewish state, not the policies. You can criticize Israel, you can criticize the government, but when I say anti-Zionism, I'm talking about the position is that the Jewish state should be eliminated. And there, Holocaust denial comes in. Well, the Zionists exploit their bloody history to justify their state. So we should disregard that history. And then again, in my experience, one of the things I've done is to examine high school textbooks on world history, European history, American history for their treatment of Holocaust, Jews, Judaism, religious history, and so on. And almost without exception, those textbooks relegate the Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust in the category of victims in general. And they'll define the Holocaust as Hitler's murder of Jews, communists, handicapped, homosexuals, and others that Hitler didn't like, and others, right? Ignoring totally that the Holocaust was the final solution to the Jewish question, right? So there's that de-Judaizing of the Holocaust that I see prevalent in the schools now. So yeah, it's still there.
Thank you. So we have another question. In regard to Chomsky, what rationale does he give for writing an anti-Semitic denial book? Or did he give one?
There's no rationale. I mean, when he was asked about it, he claimed, and this is a major intellectual. I really didn't know what the book was about. I thought it was kind of opposing, Israel and Zion, and Chomsky is a notorious anti-Zionist himself. So, and maybe I should point out here that Holocaust denial finds a place among Jews. Norman Finkelstein, good example. Why? Because they're anti-Zionism. You have many Jews among anti-Zionists, and I could name organizations, but I won't. But there's this historical phenomenon of Jews wanting to be regarded as good Jews by people who hate Jews. And so they will buy into anti-Semitic discourse, and in Chomsky, this is an extreme case. And when you ask about a rationale, it's not about reason. It's about hatred. It's about incitement. It's, the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic discourse is not propaganda, so-called. It's not to inform or to persuade, but to incite. And Hitler himself says this in Mein Kampf. The purpose of propaganda is to incite hatred. It's not to inform or persuade, it's to incite. And you see this on campuses across the world.
So to follow up on it, so another question we had, with the popularity of Anne Frank being taught in the United States, what relationship does it have to the Judaizing aspects that you mentioned in relationship to Holocaust denial?
Wow, boy, is that a good question. It's not just, okay, the popularizing of Anne Frank has very little to do with the actual diary of Anne Frank. Most people have not actually read the diary line by line. We know the film versions, we know the stage production, we know all people are basically good, But if you read the diary, you know that's not her last word, and that's not where she left her agony and her turmoil. So we de-Judaize Anne Frank. It's the diary of a young girl, right? It's a young girl who found herself in a very scary situation. She's the victim of racism, which is not anti-Semitism, is not racism. Racism is a form of anti-Semitism. So this, and she reassures us in most of these versions that she never lost faith. Okay, so she is exploited, de-Judaized, so that we don't have to face the Holocaust. Instead of dealing with the Holocaust, we deal with Anne Frank. And I've been to classes, many schools, 8th grade, they read Anne Frank, and they're horrified when I inform them that Anne was not a Dutch Jew. She was a German Jew. Her family fled Germany, went to Holland, tried to get into the United States, and we said no. And she was ultimately down the stairs, put on a train to Auschwitz, and died, and was found in a pile of bodies in Bergen-Belsen. Okay, and they're horrified. We didn't let Anne in. We didn't let her here. No, we didn't let her in. We didn't let her family in. So we find all kinds of ways to convince ourselves we're dealing with the Holocaust. We can have a good cry and feel better without dealing with it, and in fact avoiding it, and in essence denying it.
To follow up, do you think that identity politics exacerbates Holocaust belittlement?
What politics?
Identity.
Yes, of course. Look, in many ways, anti-Semitism thrives on identity politics. Why? Because identity politics rests upon a distinction between self and other. I'm me and you are the other. Okay. Jewish teaching from the Torah, when I say Jewish, it's from the Torah, undermines identity politics. Why? Because we have the teaching that each of us is a child of Adam. The Hebrew word for human being is Ben Adam, child of Adam. Therefore, each of us is tied to the other. Each of us, we're all family. We're all connected. And the commandment in the Torah repeated most frequently, it's the commandment to love and care for the stranger. And it has the same wording, love your neighbor as yourself. It's the exact same wording, love the stranger as yourself. V'ahavta l'gerer kamocha. The kamocha means that is who you are. Who you are, your identity lies in loving the stranger, the other, the weird one, because you're both children of God, you're both children of Adam, and your identity is tied to his or her identity. So identity politics exploits this distance and this isolation between one and the other. And it feeds into, in many cases, anti-Semitic agendas.
So I do have a couple more questions, if you don't mind staying on for a few more minutes that came up.
Sure.
Okay. So we were asked, how do you feel that Holocaust fiction is so popular that dilutes the truth of survivor experience? And how do you reach this next generation that is so media focused?
Holocaust fiction, that's a sweeping term. Elie Wiesel once said that a novel about Treblinka is either not a novel or it's not about Treblinka. There's not all fictional works written about the Holocaust or with the Holocaust as a theme count, in my view, as Holocaust fiction. As you know, I teach course on Holocaust literature, and I'm very careful in my selections. Holocaust fiction is a form of testimony, a form of remembrance, a form of confrontation. It transforms the reader into a witness. It's to the extent that it's popular, I'm not sure that that's the word, but to the extent that it has an appeal to us, it lays claim to our soul. Elie Wiesel once said that the ultimate mystery of the Holocaust is that whatever happened took place within the soul. And that's why this subject is so compelling, whether we turn away from it or we turn to it. Those of us who study it, and Sarah, you know this as well as anyone, we feel something from beyond laying claim to us. We can't say no to it without at least, going into some kind of complex. What do we do with future generations? I think we have to engage the Holocaust as witnesses, not just as instructors or teachers. A true teacher is a witness. A true teacher is a witness and transforms his or her students into witnesses. A true teacher who stands before a classroom stands for something, and his or her students see that and know that, and this is passed on to them. So we have to give our students a sense of legacy and not just instruction, a sense, and they want this sense of meaning. They want to have a sense of something precious entrusted to their care, a life and death stake concerning sanctity of human being entrusted to their care. So conveying this legacy to a future generation has more to do with this sense of testimony and urgency and ethical implication than it does just about transmitting information. Information alone doesn't make you a witness. It's the outcry of the soul that's here that is silenced in Holocaust denial.
So I'm going to go with just one more question. We've had a few, but the final question that we're going to be able to get to is, can you speak a little bit about Holocaust denial, specifically in Egypt, and even more specifically within their education system?
Oh my. No, it's not just Egypt, by the way. It's throughout the Muslim world, unfortunately, in the school curricula, especially, well, I'll just leave it at that. But it has to do with the delegitimization of the Jewish presence in the region. Again, the Jews don't need a haven because the Jews were never threatened. And in fact, the Jews themselves are a threat everywhere, including in the perpetration of the Holocaust. Here, this is the anti-Semitic premise in Egypt that, as I said before, it's not that all Jews are evil, but all evil is Jewish. And one of the sheikhs of Egypt is named Muhammad Hussein Yaqub. He declared, it's with Al-Azhar University, the flagship university of the Muslim world, Al-Azhar University. He says that if the Jews would leave Palestine, would we stop hating them? No. We would hate them, we would fight them for all time. It has nothing to do with the occupation. The hatred of the Jews of Israel has nothing to do with the Jewish state. The state is hated not because they occupy something, but because it's Jewish. And so Sheikh Yaqub says, we are engaged in an eternal battle with them. So part of that battle entails removing the Jews from history. Just recently, There was this statement that came out of the West Bank that the Jews never had any historical presence on the Temple Mount. In fact, this is in the PLO charter. They were not on the Temple Mount. There was no Temple of Solomon. They were not in the Holocaust. This, again, let me just end with this. The Jews have a history of expulsion from space, from all the countries of Europe, and Holocaust denial is an expulsion of Jews from time, from history, from the past, and from the future. And you see this systematically in Egypt and throughout the curricula, and you see it in many forms of anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for your great questions. And thank you for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Patterson, so much for your wonderful talk. Please be on the lookout for our upcoming events. You can go to our website, which is ctvoicesofhope.org. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And I hope you all have a great rest of your night.